To be or not to be? That is the question. Everybody's heard Hamlet and knows Shakespeare, but a lot of folks don't realize that we've been asking those kinds of questions about what is it that makes us human since as long as we've been keeping track of what people have been up to. My name's Sheldon Solomon. I'm a psychologist by trade, and I'm delighted to be part of the All Things Have Standing program, where today we're going to think about the nature of the human enterprise from both a psychological as well as a philosophical vantage point. So let's talk a little bit about psychology, which goes back to Aristotle. Everyone's heard the term ology, the study of. Psyche, we usually think about as mind, but Aristotle and the ancient Greeks, that term was actually for the word soul. For Aristotle, the soul is just the essence of a natural body infused with life. And that's a difficult concept. But Aristotle goes on and he says, okay, well, what does that mean? And he says, well, let's think about that. If an axe were alive, then the soul of an axe would be to chop. If you can pluck your eyeball out of your head, don't do this at home, and it could still function, then the soul of an eyeball would be to see. The soul of a woodpecker is to peck. The soul of a grasshopper is to hop. You get the idea. All right, but what does that mean about the soul of humans? What is it? What is the essence of the human being? And here the answer is it depends on who you ask. Most of us are familiar with the notion Homo sapiens, that we're wise creatures. Aristotle thought that one unique aspect of our humanity is our capability for rational thought. But that's not the only contender. There's what's called Homo Ludens. Ludens is Latin for play. Some people think that we're quintessentially playful creatures. Another one is Homo Faber, that we're tool-making creatures, that we can't help it. We just need to make stuff. Another one is Homo aestheticus, that we're not just reasonable creatures, but we also like it when we're surrounded by beauty. Another one is Homo narrans, that we're naturally storytelling creatures. And the point that I like to make is that those are all wonderful depictions of the human animal. And what they each do, in my estimation, is to focus our attention on aspects of our humanity that are certainly important and certainly worthy of our collective cogitation. And as you'll see, these are all important elements of the Spark Hunter file moving forward. Also important for our purposes are what existential philosophers have to contribute to the idea of what it means to be a human being. And our work is based considerably on Martin Heidegger, who in 1927, I believe, wrote his very famous Being and Time. And Heidegger starts that book with a tale from one of Plato's dialogues. Theaetetus, or Theaetetus most likely, is the name of the dialogue. And it is about an allegorical situation surrounding how we acquire knowledge and the origin of philosophy. And it's just a lovely tale. There's a philosopher thought to be Thales, and like a lot of philosophers, he's walking around with his head in the sky in his celestial contemplations. And watching him do that is a servant girl. And the philosopher is so preoccupied with his philosophizing that he doesn't realize that he's walking straight ahead into an open well. And he eventually tumbles into the well, and the servant girl is just completely convulsing in mirthful laughter. And what Heidegger points out is that in his estimation, philosophy took a really wrong turn thousands of years ago when we basically followed The philosopher in Theaetetus's tale, someone who is got their head in the clouds, trafficking in abstractions. And according to Heidegger, this ended up with a philosophy that culminates with Descartes' idea, I think, therefore I am, where human beings, the word being is seen mostly as a noun, and humans are depicted as kind of disembodied, passive, acultural, ahistorical observers of a mathematically precise universe. This is not to condemn that philosophy on practical grounds. It is, after all, what ultimately gave us the science that allowed us to go to the moon. All right, but it cannot, nor will it ever be able to, give us any insight about why we would go to the moon or what we would do once we got there. And the point that Heidegger makes is that if we're to make any productive inroads to get a better understanding of human beings, then we need to think more in terms not of human beings where being is a noun, but rather humans being, where being is a verb. He believes that we need to go back and we need to philosophize from the perspective of the servant girl. And we need to do that by just investigating what he called the everydayness of life. And he thought that if we were able to do that, that we would get a lot further. And the philosopher Sylvia Benso, who we will learn about quite a bit in the program in the sessions to come, she referred to this very noble and worthy goal as the pursuit of embodied wisdom. All right, so let's do it. Let's just think about everydayness in terms of the way that Heidegger presented it in Being and Time. And I like how he starts out when he says, every one of us is thrown into the world. I like thrown, that it gives us this kinetic, this idea of activity. We're thrown into the world in a particular time and place, and we are immediately absorbed in that world, engaged with that world, concerned about that world, affected by that world and everything in it as we are assimilated into our culture and marinated in our culture's language and traditions and beliefs. And so from this perspective, we are anything but passive, disembodied spectators viewing the world from an exalted position. We are, even before we know that we're here, we are dynamic creatures that are culturally immersed, who are actively engaged with the world around us and care quite a bit about ourselves and everything else. And this is reflected, Heidegger claims, in what he calls care. And care is manifested by understanding and mood and discourse. Heidegger's point is that by the time you wake up one day and you are in America, you're already an American. You are already an ambulatory cultural artifact who has quite a bit of an understanding of the world around you. Your name is, in fact, a cultural construction given to you by your parents. You know before you can walk or talk what the McDonald's golden arches represent or the Nike check. You know that Santa Claus is a good guy and Satan is a bad guy. And that's what is meant by this notion that we already have considerable understanding of the world by the time we're aware of our existence in it. In addition to that, our view of the world and our view of ourselves is at all times, whether we're aware of it or not, infused with what Heidegger called mood. We'll keep it simple. A mood is just a state of affect. And you know when you're in a good mood or when you're in a bad mood. But mood can also be a reflection of our immediate surroundings. You know the difference between the mood at a picnic versus the mood at a funeral. And even different historical moments have different moods. The Roaring Twenties was quite different than the Great Depression that followed several years thereafter. All right, so we understand the world around us. We are affected by it in terms of our mood. And all of this is reflected in what's called discourse, which is just a fancy term for language. Language could be one of the defining characteristics of human beings, and we're all familiar with it, but mostly as a means of communication by which we transmit information. And the point here, I like how Julian Jaynes, a psychologist, put it when he said language is an organ of perception. It's not just a means of communication. According to Heidegger, language is what helps us discover aspects of our surroundings. And I like popping a hyphen between dis and cover. It helps us uncover things about the world that we might not otherwise notice. And this helps us not only help ourselves better understand the world, but then we're eager to share our understandings with folks around us. And this is much more than communication. I would call it communion in the service of fostering good relations between ourselves and our fellow humans. All right, well, in a nutshell, that's a decent enough depiction of Heidegger's notion of being for the moment. Let's switch gears and get to the time part, because his book was Being and Time. And what he says is, look, we are beings who exist in a temporal horizon. And my first reaction was, duh, of course, dude. I don't have time for your pontifications about time. But if you take the time to think about what Heidegger thinks about time, it is timely and important, because he makes a distinction between two kinds of time. He says, well, look, there's the time that most of us are familiar with. I'll call it linear time, where at any given moment, it's now, it's the present, and where we dice up into time into these little neat humanly constructed packets that we call minutes and days and hours. Just like sandwich meat, we pile time on top of time. So here I am in the present, and right before now, that's the immediate past. I like Heidegger, he calls it nevermore. And then wherever I am now, whatever's going to happen next, that's not yet. All right, so that's linear time. I'm always right now. I just got done with the past, and whatever happens next is the present. And the point is that that kind of time, which we're all familiar with, that's awesome for a train schedule. That's awesome for knowing what time you have to get up and go to school. But that has very little to do with time as we actually experience it in existential terms. And my little fortune cookie nugget, I call it Back to the Future Now, to understand Heidegger's view of time. Because what he says is, look, at any given moment, here you are, but to the extent that you care about anything, you're always oriented towards the future because you care about something. But whatever it is that you care about is ultimately determined by the past. And so time is not like a straight line. Think about it more like a Mobius strip where it's constantly bending back, because every now has one step towards the future as we care about what happens, but is ultimately determined by the past. But of course, the only instant where we can do anything is the immediate now. Back to the future now. Well, Faulkner says the past is not done, it's not even past, or something along those lines. But I love in his books, he talks about experiences that all of us have had where our sense of time is radically different than normal linear time. He has one place in Absalom, Absalom, where somebody strikes a match on a porch and then they start thinking about things, and you have this interior dialogue, and 50 pages later, you realize that all of that has happened in the time that it takes from the match to get to the pipe, well, from the striking it on the porch to the pipe in his mouth. I think this is just an important thing to think about when we try to understand our own subjective experiences. Sometimes a minute seems like a lifetime, and a lifetime can seem like a minute. All right, so being and time. Well, what next? Well, what next, according to Heidegger, is a particular kind of mood that we all experience from time to varying degrees that he called anxiety. Actually, he called it Angst in the original German, and that's like anxiety squared, because most of us know what it means to be in a vague or not so vague state of dis-ease. Again, put a hyphen between dis and ease. But angst has other connotations that on top of apprehension is this kind of eerie, uncanny, we don't feel quite at home. And this is not that we're not in our house, but just this idea that we're unsettled and we're not feeling all that comfortable in our surroundings. And according to Heidegger, we all experience angst, and we experience it to the extent that we recognize the reality of the human condition, which is the inevitability of our own death. All right, for Heidegger, death is the ultimate challenge because it consists of the utter obliteration of ourselves. It is something that cannot be reversed, cannot be overcome, cannot generally be anticipated or controlled. Existentially, therefore, it is the ultimate uncertainty and represents the profound incompleteness of every human life to the extent that all of us essentially die with unfinished business. We are not here to witness the culmination of our own existence. For the existentialists, the awareness of our own mortality and the psychological discombobulation that results from that is really a psychological fork in the road. And what Heidegger argued is that for many people, the angst engendered by the realization of death is unbearable. And what we literally do, he called it a flight from death, that we flee from the awareness of death by ardently embracing our culturally constructed belief system and clinging tenaciously to the social role that we inhabit within it. In so doing, Heidegger argues, we might reduce anxiety, but at a very terrible cost, because it is an abandonment of our real self in a frenetic flight from death that renders us culturally constructed meat puppets tranquilized by the trivial. More on this in future sessions, but let it suffice to say that a substantial proportion of the most daunting difficulties that humankind now confronts is either a direct or indirect consequence, a malevolent consequence of this flight from death in an effort to flee from angst. But it doesn't have to be that way. In fact, angst we don't have to be happy about it, but it could be literally our calling to ourselves, summoning ourselves to find ourselves. All right, well, what does he mean by that? Well, angst has a way of sandblasting away, at least momentarily, our cultural constructions. We realize the ultimately fictitious and groundless nature of what has been described to us as an absolute depiction of reality. And so I grew up thinking, oh, I'm Sheldon Solomon. I was born in the Bronx. I'm a male. I'm a professor in New York in the 21st century. And that's how things were meant to be. But of course, if you think about it even for less than a second, you know that it didn't have to be that way. I could have been born in Mongolia in the 3rd century as an illiterate goat herder, or maybe as an illiterate goat. When I realized that, well, that could be distressing, but it could also be completely liberating and uplifting if I can do two things psychodynamically. If I can come to terms with death, and if I can resolve what's called existential guilt. I come to terms with death. I have to accept the reality of the human condition that I, like all living things, will someday die. All right, well, again, you might be saying, duh, I know I'm gonna die. Right, but when you're saying that, always in the back of your head, the next thing is I'm gonna die at some vaguely unspecified future moment. But as long as you're saying that, that's not coming to terms with death. That's kicking the psychological can down the road by trying to put a few slices of white bread time between you and your impending doom. Because the reality is that a comet can blow through this door and vaporize me in a second. I can walk out today on a beautiful day and get infected by the pandemic. I can go downtown and have my head blown off by a disgruntled postal worker. The fact of the matter is that our death is always immediately impending. And it is only when one has the courage and the psychological fortitude to acknowledge that fact that you're in a position, existentially speaking, to get the most out of life thereby. All right, but to do that, now I've come to terms with death, and now I have to accept that I'm guilty. All right, this is not guilty in the sense of a moral transgression. This is guilty in the sense that Jean-Paul Sartre, or Sartre, as the French put it, he said we are condemned to choose. That even though I am born in a time and place not of my choosing, in a body not of my volition, and that those factors radically diminish the options that I have at my disposal. I can't be a goat herder in Mongolia in the 3rd century. I can't give birth to children. I can't be a professional basketball player because the Lord put me in a carcass half the size of a jockey. And yet, despite those constraints, it is my both pleasure and prerogative as a human and my responsibility as a human to make choices nonetheless. And moreover, I have to know that when I make choices, they're not always going to be good ones. See, we love to choose. Human beings, we love choice, but we're less happy about assuming responsibility for those choices. And all of us in our more courageous moments will admit that some of our choices have been poor ones and that we might have been better off making other choices. And I love a Romanian poet, Maria Rilke, and he talks about the guilt of unlived life. And there's existential guilt. Henry Miller, one of my favorite authors, he just says we are all guilty of a crime, the great crime of not living life to the fullest. All right, so let's say that we get that far. We have what Heidegger calls a moment of vision, where we come to terms with our mortality, where we accept responsibility for our choices. What next? Is this a magical and radical transformation? Yes and no. On the one hand, Heidegger's point is that someone who's gone through this process is still a historically situated, culturally constructed artifact. And in many ways, the world doesn't look much different. Here's a whiff of Buddhism, where the Buddha says enlightenment is quite ordinary, and yet it's not the same. And it's not the same, according to Heidegger, because I am now in a position to live my life on my terms. And I like the particular words that Heidegger employs here, at least the ones I'm familiar with in translation. He says a person on this end of that kind of experience will have a solicitous regard for other entities and other individuals. English translation, you're going to care. You're going to care about everything and everyone. And as a result of that care, you're going to be in a better position to weigh what your particular options are and to take advantage of the opportunities that you now have at your disposal. And the result, he argues, is first of all anticipatory resoluteness. All right, anticipatory. Well, here we are back to the time thing. All right, because I care, I'm looking forward. But I'm not just vaguely looking forward as an abstraction. I'm resolutely, with admirable purpose and determination, I'm scanning my horizon at the present to see what my best choices are in light of my past. And here I am in a position to jump into life as a result of that kind of psychological fortitude. Thereafter, Heidegger describes life as an adventure, an ongoing adventure perfused with unshakable joy. And I love that when I read it for the first time, because this is not a naive Mary Poppins-like creature saying, oh, if you do this, that's going to banish pain, that's going to banish anxiety, that's going to banish suffering. No, it will do none of that. What it will do is to counterbalance those universal human affectations with other qualities that ultimately render our lives richer personally and interpersonally, for that matter. All right, so we started with the question, to be or not to be. And for the moment, let's just note that where we're at is to be human is somewhat different than to just be the average being. There's a lot of beings, and most beings, as Heidegger tells us, they respire. And humans respire, but we're the only beings that are capable of being and even becoming, because while we respire, we also do other stuff. We inquire, we aspire, we inspire. And those are the qualities that render us distinctly and uniquely human. And this is what we now have to think about when we next congregate, is how is it that we got this way? If we're all products of evolution, then why is it that we ended up as the only entity for which the question about the meaning of being arises? So, keep being.